Hey, good afternoon. I am Tom Sheffield, Senior Director of Cybersecurity at Target, and I lead our global identity and access management program. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the passkey considerations for enterprise RPs as you determine how you want to deploy passkeys in your environment. It was just 13 months ago that the FIDO Alliance and its members announced support for passkeys. And 4 months later, we had the first implementations from Apple and Google released to the public. If you attended Authenticate 2022, in my presentation, I spent just a minute or so talking about some of our early considerations for enterprise use cases as we began doing our discovery on passkeys. And as Dean mentioned, earlier this week, the FIDO Alliance released a series of 4 white papers discussing passkeys and their use within the enterprise. The considerations that I'm going to highlight today are covered in more detail in those white papers if you want to learn more. So let's jump right into the first consideration. And I'll suggest that this is probably more of a statement than consideration. But as Dean mentioned, passkeys are a password replacement. They're safer, faster, and easier to use than a password. A passkey is a FIDO credential that is phishing resistant, cryptographically backed, and leave no secret to be stolen or compromised. If you take nothing else away today, remember that passkeys are better than passwords, period. Now, Dean just shared this slide moments ago to describe the 2 types of passkeys, sync passkeys and device-bound passkeys, and some of the nuances and differences between them, the benefits security-wise versus security-wise of each one. I'm not going to redrain the slide, but what I'll highlight is that there are 5 elements within the passkey ecosystem that I'm going to talk about today. They're really the drivers for some of the considerations that we're going to talk about in more detail. Dean also showed the security spectrum. Again, passwords being at the far left-hand side of the spectrum, 60-year-old technology that hasn't really evolved too much over time. We all know the inherent limitations and weaknesses of passwords. Over the last 10 or 15 years, we've been layering on legacy MFA, typically in the form of some sort of one-time password mechanism on top of passwords. That is an attempt to secure accounts from attackers. It may help, it really helps, I should say, with what I would call opportunistic accounts or drive-by accounts. So think of traditional password-based accounts, password spraying, brute forcing, et cetera. But it doesn't do a lot to stop targeted attacks like phishing. At the far right-hand side of the spectrum, again, you have those device-bound passkeys. We saw these previously in what I would call first-generation FIDO credentials, so pre-passkeys, if you will. But we also see the same concept in device-bound passkeys. These are generally represented as either a hardware security key, but from a passkey provider perspective, Microsoft continues to deploy device-bound passkeys in their passkey implementation. And then somewhere, in the middle, maybe right of center of the spectrum, again, you have the concept of sync passkeys. And all those user experience benefits that Dean talked about have some security trade-offs, have some security considerations that we all need to be aware of as we decide whether or not they're going to work for us. Right now, we see that the Apple and Google are each deploying sync passkeys. So when you sign up for a passkey at an RP on one of those devices, you're automatically going to get a sync passkey. And that's going to be synced into their respective cloud ecosystems or sync fabrics, if you will. Dean also touched on the fact that we're now seeing password managers enter the game. So maybe the name might change to credential managers in the future. But nonetheless, if you had concerns in the past that Google and Apple and Microsoft, as the big 3 platform providers, we're going to get in the middle of all the authentication in the world. Note that that's really not the case anymore. We're beginning to see a lot of movement within the password manager space for them to be able to deploy sync passkeys as well. The second consideration, again, maybe more of a statement, but I will suggest right now that passkeys are a multi-factor authenticator. However, whether or not they're acceptable in your environment does have some local considerations that we're going to talk about next. If you've been following the NIST 863B-4 series of guidelines, it's an initial public draft now. Although not represented by name, the concept of a sync passkey was introduced. Specifically, it was called a multi-factor cryptographic software authenticator. These can be used up to an Authenticator Assurance Level 2 or AAL2 level. We continue to have a recognition of a device-bound passkey, although it's not called a device-bound passkey in the guidelines. This is defined as a multi-factor cryptographic device whose key material shall not be exported from the device. Again, this is the same thing we had in the first generation FIDO credential. It's what we have today in a device-bound passkey. These can be used in certain use cases up to Authenticator Assurance Level 3 or AAL3. Now, how do you know which AAL is for you? And I'll begin by suggesting that if you rely on password plus legacy MFA today, I suspect that sync passkeys should work as a multi-factor authenticator in your environment. There may be some other considerations you want to think about, but you do not have any obvious requirements, seemingly, that would require you to have anything above an AAL3 authenticator. Now, let's look at some cases where you might. If you're a government entity, you may be, for example, required to use a FIPS 140-2 validated security key for authentication. Or maybe you're required through a specific government guideline or requirement or otherwise to use a specific authenticator assurance level. So, for example, in the Department of Defense, there is a DODI 8520.03, which specifically requires AAL3 levels of assurance during authentication. In these cases, sync passkeys aren't going to work for you. There may be regulatory considerations you have to think about. Now, I'm not aware of any specific regulatory requirements that specifically require AAL3. I suspect because passkeys are so new, you're more likely to encounter auditors or assessors who either don't yet understand passkeys or whose interpretation of the regulatory requirements suggests to them that a synced passkey is not sufficient for authentication. And I think this presents a great education opportunity for us as identity experts, and it does for us as security practitioners to be able to explain to the regulator, to explain to the auditor, to explain to your cyber leadership team how a synced passkey is significantly better than password plus MFA and should be able to be used for a secure authentication transaction, even in regulated situations. And then finally, you may be driven by your local risk appetite. This could be something formal. You may have some requirement, for example, in your organization that you align to specific guidance, such as NIST. Maybe you have some language in your local security policy that requires you to have a different level of authentication for a certain type of user, or maybe for a certain application. So as an example, maybe your cloud administrators or your system administrators are required to have a higher level of assurance than a normal user accessing another application. Or maybe you decide to protect your crown jewels with a higher level of authenticator for the users who are accessing them. For most other cases in the enterprise, I think generally speaking, a synced passkey offers significant improvement over password plus legacy MFA, and is definitely something you should be considering in your environment. If we go back to that security spectrum that we saw before, if you're unable to convince your regulators or your auditors or your cyber leadership team that a synced passkey as a multi-factor authentication is enough, you could go back to relying on a conditional multi-factor authenticator. So dynamically evaluating risk at runtime and deciding when to step up. And then when you do need to step up, you can leverage those existing methods for step up that you already have configured for your users. The key here, however, is that first factor was a strong factor of authentication unto and by itself. Layering on a multi-factor authentication on top of it just makes it even stronger. The next thing to consider around passkeys is that the client configuration matters, and it really is going to matter even more with synced passkeys. And it really comes down to user experience, which we all know is so critical, because if the user has a bad first experience, they're less likely to try again in the future, or they're more likely to jump out of the experience because it's not working for them. So there's a few client considerations that you want to think about. The first one's MDM configuration. In a synced passkey model, remember that the passkey is actually synced up into the sync fabric. So if you're in the Apple ecosystem, for example, and you're registering on one of the Apple devices, you need to make sure that your MDM configuration has iCloud keychain syncing enabled or not blocked. Because if you have keychain syncing blocked, you're actually going to block the creation of the passkey, or you're going to have to prompt the user to have keychain syncing, which they're obviously not going to be able to control themselves because it's controlled at an MDM level. Similarly, the account, the cloud account that the user's logged into from that device also matters. If you tell your users, for example, on enterprise workstations, not to log into any cloud at all because we don't want anything synced to the cloud, or your users log into an enterprise account on their enterprise workstations, but they log into a personal account on their personal devices, now the ability to sync passkeys across becomes difficult. It's still possible with some steps, but you've introduced friction that gives users a chance to jump out of the process anytime they want. And there's also specific considerations around the actual device configuration itself. So for example, I think Dean mentioned the FIDO cross-device authentication flow. He actually did the video demo of the Windows and Apple devices working together. If you don't have Bluetooth configured and enabled between those two devices at the time you're trying it, users actually be prompted to turn it on before that authentication bootstrapping ceremony can be completed. So in both cases, we may not have blocked the registration or blocked the creation of a passkey, but you've definitely introduced friction that has an impact on user experience. And again, we all know that user experience is so critical because if the experience doesn't work for the user, they're not going to do it, or they're going to try and work around it. And we know that's where problems usually occur. The next consideration is really around the threat landscape. And I'm going to suggest that the threat landscape really changes quite a bit as we start getting to sync passkeys. Again, we talked about the benefits of syncing passkeys. There are significant user experience benefits. Being able to get a new device and seamlessly be able to get logged in to all your relying parties from that new device is a very cool feature. But doing so, opening that capability up, prevents some new opens new attack vectors that you need to consider. The first one is that you now have a new dependence on passkey providers. If you think back to the password model that exists today, we are all responsible for the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the passwords of our users. That responsibility lies solely on us. When you get into the sync passkey world, you now have a new dependence on the passkey providers. The security of their sync fabric, whether or not they require or enable multi-factor authentication, for example, whether or not they leverage end-to-end encryption, both become critical. Now, what we've seen from both Apple and Google is that they're both now creating passkeys at the registration. So when you're getting a new Apple device and creating a new iCloud account, you're now creating a passkey, which is great because we now have a even higher assurance the user is going to log in with that passkey to their account, to their cloud account, to be able to do the maintenance or see what's in their cloud account. And also, both Apple and Google have published their security models, which is really good. The transparency is awesome. It demonstrates that they really understand the responsibility that they've taken upon themselves by providing sync passkeys across their ecosystem. You should expect a similar publication from any sync passkey provider in your ecosystem. And the other thing that's important to consider when we talk about our dependence on passkey providers is attestation. And again, Dean talked about this moments ago, but it's really important that you understand that we're in the first generation FIDO credential model, attestations were generally provided, especially in the hardware security key realm. When we get into passkeys, specifically sync passkeys, attestation is actually optional in the passkey specification. So with sync passkeys, as a relying party, you may request an attestation during a registration ceremony, and the authenticator may provide it to you, but again, it may not. And so you won't know until you go through the ceremony whether or not you're going to get the attestation. So what this means is you can't rely on it to know that the passkey being presented is coming from the specific passkey provider that you expect it to. So the impact is that as an RP, you can't restrict the registration of specific synced passkeys from new or unknown, or maybe a non-trusted passkey provider during registration. Just something you have to be aware of as you go through the registration ceremony. Now, there continue to be discussions within the FIDO Alliance and its membership around the desire or the need to provide attestations, but as of right now, there's no commitment that all passkey providers are going to do so. In a similar way, we also have to think about the threat actor from an attack vector perspective as we think about the changing or evolving threat landscape. New malware variants now come into play. We've seen in the dark underground a few advertisements for a couple of new malware variants, specifically MacStealer and Amos, which both go after the iCloud keychains, including passkeys. And so now the importance of endpoint protection across your devices continues to be critical. You want to make sure that your users' devices, whether they're managed devices that you're accountable for, or they're personal devices that your user are accountable for, making sure they stay up to date becomes really important. Because if that malware variant does get released, you want to make sure users are protected from it. So you don't have a lot of control over the user's device, and so you'll have to come up with ways to ensure that they stay at an acceptable patch level as they're accessing your environment. There's also continued risk of downgrade attacks. As people register for passkeys today, I'm not aware of any RP who's actually getting rid of the password completely yet. They still exist, right? And because they still exist, they are still at risk of being attacked. And so as an RP, we all still risk attackers trying to phish those user passwords from our users. So what does that mean to us? It means as an RP, we have to continue to rely on our risk engine for any password-based flows. We have to continue to require strong identity verification processes for all password reset and account unlock flows to be able to identify, your user from a threat actor. And then finally, as obvious as it is to say out loud when we talk about sync passkeys, sync passkeys sync. And I call that passkey portability. And so just like a password can be shared through word of mouth or written down or emailed or otherwise to somebody, passkeys can also be shared. AirDrop, for example, in the Apple ecosystem is one thing that's been enabled by Apple. So just like a password, sharing of a passkey requires proximity and the receiver to be known, meaning I don't walk down the street randomly giving my password to strangers that I run into. That wouldn't make any sense. So within the Apple ecosystem, the way Apple sort of ensures that these principles are held true is that they make sure that the recipient of the passkey that I'm sending it to must be in my contact list. And also the way Apple AirDrop works, the two devices must be close together. So that handles the proximity and the known receiver side of the equation. So Apple is doing quite a bit to help ensure that passkeys are shared securely between two parties. They're making conscious decision to do so. And then again, just like a password, as an RP, you won't know when or if a sync passkey is shared. That transaction happens independent of the RP. If I share my passkey with a friend or a spouse or otherwise, the sites that I go to don't know that I've shared it necessarily. So what that means is that as RPs, we have to rely on either a device fingerprint or a risk engine or something like that to recognize that the sync passkey being presented at login is coming from a new device. And then we have to make a decision. Do I want to trust it inherently and just let it authenticate seamlessly? Or maybe we might make a decision to step it up, for example, because I can recognize it's been shared and I want to make sure that I recognize the user to whom it's been shared. Now, the one difference between sharing a passkey and sharing a password is whether or not you're using your sync passkey as a multi-factor authenticator in your environment. If you are, sharing a passkey has a different consideration now. There's now a bigger impact of loss or exposure of that passkey than if the password was shared. Because again, the password is only a single factor of authentication at an AAL level 1 level. So as an RP, we have a requirement to educate our users on the risk of sharing passkeys, just like we provide guidance historically against sharing enterprise passwords, for example. And so we talk about education. Education of users is important, but you also have to consider education of some of your stakeholders. It's really important that they understand what a passkey is and how it fits in this new authentication paradigm. We talk about the idea of Passkey Cardinality. If you think about a password again, for example, most users have a single password per site. With some rare exceptions, there may be situations where they have multiple, but generally speaking, I think we can all agree that users generally have one password per site. So if I'm calling in the help desk or I'm interacting with my security operations center, right, it's pretty obvious that it's a one-to-one relationship. As we go into the passkey model, because passkeys can sync, it's really important that everybody understands how syncing actually works. So let me paint a very simple example for you so we can sort of draw this out. Let's say that I go to a website, acme.com, and I log into that site, I register on that site for a passkey on my iPhone. At the moment of registration, a passkey is created and there's a single copy on my device. Now, obviously, a copy has been synced up to my sync fabric, iCloud in this example. But from a device perspective, I now have one key on one device. I now flip over to my Mac and I go through the same authentication experience to acme.com. And acme.com is smart enough through the FIDO protocols that says, hey, Tom, I recognize you have a FIDO credential. Do you want to use that sync passkey to log into to acme.com from your new device? And I say, heck yeah, I do. I don't want to enter my password anymore. And I want to securely protect my account. So I go through the login process, and at completion, a second copy of that passkey is now populated on my local device. And so now there's 2 copies of the same key, both within my cloud sync fabric. Let's also assume that Acme.com is a consumer shopping site, and my wife and I share accounts because we want to have shared shopping lists and shared loyalty rewards and the like. And so I want my wife to have the same experience that I do on Acme.com, and I want to protect our account as securely from her device as I do from my device. So I go through the exercise of airdropping my passkey to her device. And so as I do that, I already had those original 2 passkeys, the 2 copies of the first passkey we talked about before, but now a third copy is created and synced into her cloud sync fabric. And so now we have 3 copies of one passkey that are shared across the environment. Now, if there's a problem that one of us had logging in and we had to call our help desk, if one of us calls in, the help desk has to understand that, number one, there can be multiple passkeys, so they have to be able to understand which one we're talking about. And then we have to be able to communicate back and forth to each other to be able to say, this is the device I'm calling about. This is the device I'm having trouble logging in from. And then we each have to know what we're looking at, so we're able to solve my problem as seamlessly as possible. So what this means to as RPs is we need to provide a way for our users to be able to identify passkeys and think account settings. So when I go to my account settings page within the website, I should be able to show the user that there are multiple passkeys for the account. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. One, you can name the first passkey during registration. So I could say, Tom's iPhone as the name of the first passkey. However, as it gets synced, Tom's iPhone loses meaning because it's now been synced to my Mac and my wife's iPhone as well. So we also have to have the ability to recognize passkeys during the login ceremony. So as a user's logging in, we need to be able to we should capture where and when and on what device the login was transacted from, and then make a record of that so that when the user or my wife goes into our account settings page, we can easily see that there are, in this case, 3 different passkeys. And so the help desk can also see there are 3 different passkeys on my account, and they'll be able to help figure out which one's having a problem. Those similar considerations carry forward to your SOC, your Security Operations Center. They also have to understand that there can be multiple passkeys. So for example, if the user account at the relying party is compromised, if my account at acme.com gets compromised, traditionally, they would have reset my password and probably done an account lock on my account to make sure that we could gain control of the account from the attacker. In addition to those 2 things now, as a Security Operations Center, it is very critical for them to also simultaneously delete or invalidate or disable the passkeys at the RP site in that account settings page, because you want to make sure you don't close one door but leave the other door open. And so it's very important that your SOC understands with passkeys what settings or which authenticators, password or otherwise, need to be addressed in case of a compromised scenario. So as we wrap it up today, let me just touch on a couple of the key takeaways. What I'll begin with before I go into the specifics is everything I talked about today are considerations. They're absolutely not roadblocks. I firmly believe there is a path forward for everybody to adopt passkeys. Beyond that, if you take nothing else away from today, remember that passkeys are significantly better than passwords, both user experience and security, period. And whether or not passkeys can be used as a multi-factor authenticator in your environment is really up to you. And these considerations and the white papers can each be used as a guide to help you with your assessment. And then finally, don't wait. Passkeys provide a significant improvement over passwords. Again, both user experience and security. If you need to, step into passkeys slowly and maybe use them initially only as a password replacement. This will significantly strengthen that first factor of authentication. Then you could decide under what circumstances, for which applications, for which users, etc., you want to leverage them as a multi-factor authentication, either alone or in combination perhaps with your risk engine, for example. With that, my time is up. I thank you for spending the morning with me, and we'll talk to you soon.
Tom, do you want to take a few questions before you take off? Thank you for that presentation.
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. So if folks on the summit today haven't seen Tom's presentations previously, either at Authenticate or Identiverse, you should go back and watch them because they're fantastic. But one of the biggest takeaways I know from watching those presentations, Tom, and you touched on it here, is about education. I know that at Target you did, a big push to your employees around educating around, the new way to authenticate. What I wanted to ask you is so with the introduction of passkeys, so if an organization has a previous FIDO deployment versus a new FIDO deployment, how do you see that sort of internal education being different or the same? Or can you talk a little bit about how you might go about that, or suggest that folks go about that, the internal stakeholder education?
Yeah, for us, the only thing that changed in our model internally was our branding. We had branded our program a custom name internally based on some user testing that we had done, some discovery work that we had done. But behind the scenes, we didn't really change anything else. We now highlight a little bit more that synced passkeys, that you can get a new device and have that passkey sync the new device. But it's not a lead for us. It's a feature. It's a benefit. I think users will stumble across as they register for a passkey in our world, but it's not something we necessarily lead with. We still lead with it is a way to log in seamlessly and faster and more securely than a password, and that continues to be the driver that we've had for over 2 years now in our program.
That's great. Thank you. Sort of a just tactical thing. So I don't know how many folks within your organization have devices that don't have on-device biometrics, but there's just a question in here regarding, how to allow folks that don't have those types of devices to sign in with passkeys, and/or how would you go about, like getting over that educational hurdle with those folks? Because there's a lot of, when we talk about passkeys, there's just a lot of focus on the biometric aspect of it.
Right. Obviously, that becomes a constraining factor. So we made the decision a few years ago, ahead of our FIDO deployment decision, that we wanted to refresh all of our laptops and workstations with a biometric capable device. So we had been in a lifecycle event for a couple of years prior to joining to deploying FIDO. Similarly, I don't know of a common mobile operating system today that doesn't have a form of biometric. So I think you're probably going to be covered there. Beyond that, without the biometrics, obviously you are limited to probably using a security key as a second factor. We did some testing internally based on some internal use cases of biometric and PIN-enabled security keys. We've proven that they work in our environment. We've handed out a couple of them as demos to some of our users who had problems, but we continue to see the most of our users use platform authenticators from either a workstation or a capable mobile device.
Yeah, and I think it's just good to note sometimes that FIDO in general is not like the modality. We're agnostic to that, right? So there's ways you could unlock your phone, like with a pattern or a PIN that our protocol support. And it's all local, so it's not being shared, just like the biometrics are not being shared. So those types of mechanisms can be leveraged as well. And I've got one more. This is a good one. So what do you think about so I don't know how well to answer this from the FIDO Alliance perspective. Maybe from your perspective, have you heard about a concept, or do you think there should be something in place where shared passkey should be restricted to company managed devices?
I personally don't think so, and I specifically say that because I have a number of what I would call employee-facing web applications, right? Pay and benefits, for example, your HR information. We have a time card system, et cetera, that I don't want to restrict only to users on managed devices. It doesn't make sense to not give them the same security and user experience benefits that I get with passkeys and have them revert back to a password, be susceptible to phishing and other credential-related attacks. So I personally believe that we should be able to use passkeys globally. How you leverage them for multi-factor authenticator in your environment is a local decision. You'll have to make the decision for these applications or these types of applications. A sync passkey may be enough, and for these other types, it may not be enough. And that's something you're going to have to figure out. But I do not personally want to restrict synced passkeys to only managed devices, because there's too many other applications that people use that I think I don't want to onboard all their devices to my MDM, and I don't think we need to require that as well.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll wrap there. And I have to do it. I have to give a plug for Authenticate again. Tom will be joining us and giving a talk at Authenticate. So if you have more questions for him, sorry, Tom, you're going to have to find him at Authenticate. But thanks so much, Tom, and thank you all. And we will be just transitioning over to Hyper's J Rocks in just a moment. So stay tuned.